You are listening to Inside IASB, a podcast series dedicated to informing and encouraging Illinois School Board members. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Isaac Warren. I'm the Director of Digital Communications at the Illinois Association of School Boards. With me today, I have Sarah and Kristen, who are in our Governmental Relations Department. We're going to be talking about our federal, state, and local priorities for this year's spring session. So Kristen, Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm really excited. So we're going to just dive right into the federal priorities, which is a newer addition, because typically we don't have those, but now we have a lot of things we need to have discussion about. We need to talk a lot about these federal issues. So just to kick us off, Kristen, what are the key federal commitments?
Well, Isaac, you're absolutely right. In the past, I don't think that IASB has had to focus as much on the federal priorities because the federal funding was fairly consistent. However, one of the things that has happened over the past year is that we've really seen the importance of having that stable and consistent funding. So that is our number one priority, is stable and consistent funding for education. To give you an example of the challenge when we don't have that, over the summer, IASB was very active when the administration announced that it was going to delay some of the critical funding schools use right before the start of the school year. And that was just incredibly disruptive. And so what we are advocating for, number one, is just stable and consistent funding for our four largest education programs at the federal level, which are Title I, which aids students who are disadvantaged economically and helps schools have funds that are critical to close achievement gaps. Number two, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, so full funding for that, our assistance for students with disabilities. Number three, our school-based nutrition programs like school lunch and breakfast. And then number four, our school-based Medicaid funding, which is our school-based health services, which assists with IEP services for students with disabilities and other needs for students like mental health services. So those are our four big programs. We want to see stable and consistent funding. The proposals that Congress is considering right now for FY 2026, so we haven't even yet started on FY 2027, but for FY 2026, they do include, in addition to funding, they include provisions that would require the timely funding for schools, so that we wouldn't have actions like this summer where it was delayed, that Congress would speak on that and say that we're going to have that consistent funding throughout the year and that disbursements will go out on time. So that's what we're advocating for. To give you a little tiny bit more of a picture on the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And so we are so proud of the work that has been done by school districts across the nation, and especially in Illinois, to ensure that students with disabilities get the services they need. However, when Congress passed that legislation 50 years ago, they promised that they would provide 40% of the cost of that to assist local school districts in providing these services. It's a big endeavor. These are costly services. We want to ensure that each of those students is served in the right way, and statutorily, we're bound to do that. However, Congress has yet to meet that federal funding commitment of 40%. And so that's one of our key priorities, that they fulfill that commitment.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up the IDEA funding, because that sounds like an incredibly critical part of that whole program. The 40% is funded by Congress, and if it's not being met, I mean, it's essentially not a funded program at all. So those four priorities that you've mentioned are awesome at the federal level, and the IDEA funding specifically, I'm glad you brought that up because it is critical. And can you kind of elaborate a bit more for our listeners about why that funding promise is so critical for students with disabilities and local districts?
Absolutely. So we feel so strongly about this funding commitment that in honor of the 50th anniversary, we did an advocacy drive with our advocacy ambassadors and with our federal advocacy conference. And we really worked to increase the Illinois support for the IDEA Full Funding Act. So as I mentioned in the first answer, we really want to see Congress fulfill that 40% commitment. When they promised that, they were funding a larger percentage of what students with disabilities need. Right now, they are down to funding national average of about 10%. And so instead of meeting 40%, they're meeting 10%. And for school districts in Illinois, for some, it's even lower. At the school district where I was a school board member, the IDEA funds were down to covering between 5 and 10% of those costs. And remember, school districts are statutorily bound to provide these services. So they are funding those services. And what that means then is that IDEA funding, those services are taking up a greater and greater percentage of the overall funding for schools. So right at the time that we are really working in our school boards to increase achievement, to recover from the pandemic, to close achievement gaps, we are having less and less funding to be able to fund those important services. And so both students with disabilities and students without disabilities, they're all being impacted by the fact that the federal government is not meeting its funding promise. And school districts are having to balance all those funding needs instead of having that really critical support from the federal government to provide those services. So it matters to all of us. And so when we started talking about how to celebrate that 50th anniversary, the most important thing for us was to talk about that commitment and to ensure that we were talking about that with our Illinois legislators. And we got a great response. Because of our advocacy, 15 out of our 19 representatives and senators are sponsoring that federal legislation that would require Congress to meet that 40% commitment. So
Wow.
we're almost there. Our goal is to have everyone co-sponsoring it, but we have 15 out of 19, both senators and all but 4 of our representatives are meeting that commitment and are signing on that they want to see Congress go in that direction.
And if I could just add on to that, Isaac, I think Kristen makes a really important point is that our districts still have to continue paying for these services, whether they get the funding or not. And that we'll talk about that a little bit more, how it impacts state funding as well. But it does, I mean, having all of that money diverted away from other programming does really hurt all students. And one of the things we're hearing more and more is not just the impact on students, but the impact on teachers through all kinds of things, increased caseloads, bigger class sizes, all of those types of things too. And the pressure that it's putting on local communities and local budgets. I mean, there really is a cumulative impact on that. And so that's one of the reasons that we're really focused on meeting those commitments, because we feel like our districts have met their commitments on their end to fulfill those services and give those students what they need. And now we need to look to the state and federal government to fulfill their end of the commitment to fund those services.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing that about the funding requirements, because I think it really does show how important, not just, of course, funding is important, but also shows how when you pull the thread of what does this affect if it's not funded, it affects a lot more than probably meets the eye or someone might expect. So, and it's really encouraging to hear that 15 representatives already are on board with getting that fulfilled. So that is really encouraging and good to hear that things are changing and making progress up there. Shifting gears a little bit, Kristen, how does federal support for assessment and research help school boards make better decisions for student achievement?
Okay, so our other federal priority is to increase federal support for the tools that school board members need to drive student achievement. And we believe that those tools are accountability and assessment data, as well as federally funded evidence-based research on the critical challenges that school boards are facing as they work to help all students, achieve. So to kind of talk a little bit more about that, IASB teaches in its foundational principles that one of the primary purposes of our boards are to determine goals for students, achievement goals and other goals. And once they have those goals that they work on with their governance team, with their superintendent, they are working to monitor the progress on those goals and to hold themselves and their districts accountable, and to hold themselves accountable for those goals for all students. We believe that the federal government supports this critical work in a couple of ways. Number one, they provide longitudinal data about national student performance through the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. Number two, they work to ensure state accountability systems that are fair and balanced, but those accountability systems that also provide state-level comparable data, district to district, about student performance. And the federal government funds research on these critical challenges to see which practices and programs are having the most impact in helping school boards and school districts meet their goals for student achievement. IASB's board recently approved a new advocacy tenet that we are proposing to our national organization, the Consortium of State School Boards Association, or CASBA, and we are proposing that we add this tenet to CASBA's national platform to support these key student achievement tools. We think those critical tools are very important, and we want to see CASBA open up this dialogue about these critical tools. And we believe that that support will be key in two ways. Number one, we need these tools. These tools are what we need to drive achievement. But number two, we need to be talking about what we need in terms of improving student achievement, because by doing so, we increase the trust in the public school system. There's a lot of dialogue about failures, lots. What there isn't dialogue about are these tools that we need to see improvement. And so we believe that it will be something that increases trust in the public system to start talking about what we need, and to start talking about where we are, and to start talking about the challenges we're facing. So we hope that this will be successful at the CASBA annual business meeting in March. And we are asking for the three platforms that I mentioned, the federal data, the state data, and the federally funded evidence-based research. And we believe that that will be just what is needed to drive student achievement and the support for it at the federal level.
I was just going to add, because I think one of the things that Kristen and I talked a lot about and she really worked a lot on this proposal to CASBA. But one of the things we talked about is that I think, sometimes about those accountability tools or the assessments have been used by other groups to show something else. And one of the things we are really focused on is, what is the purpose of these assessments? And really it is for accountability, for helping students, for having tools that really inform teaching practices and programs. So I think that's one of the things that is really important to stress, is that, and I think that Kristen's done a great job with, is just we need to have our own narrative on behalf of school boards for why these tools are important, how they can help school boards, and they can be really positive. They can be really positive tools for school boards to use to move their school districts forward.
I really like the emphasis on trust and kind of building the trust in the public school system. Especially nowadays, I think really ever since COVID, we've seen a lot more questions raised about public schooling in general. And so I think that making sure that we're measuring and assessing our students to make sure that they're getting the resources they need, and they're meeting these milestones that they need to meet, that will increase the trust in our public school system. And it kind of goes into the trust edge factor as one of our workshops that we offer. And I think that trust in today's society is something that's severely lacking. And so building that trust is crucial, because with that, a lot of it can kind of build on top of that as a really strong foundation with trust.
And Isaac, if I could just say one other thing, I think another really key component that Kristen has brought into this is the importance of evidence-based research and connecting that research and finding programs and practices that work and connecting that back to school boards. Because I think, you have the data, and then the question for school boards is, what are we going to do with that data? How are we going to make improvements? And so that's been another area of focus that Kristen really has included in this whole legislative priority, that we do need to have those practices and programs that districts can access to actually try and do something to improve those student outcomes, see how it works, shift. So that is another really important component of the priority.
Yep, 100% agree. Thank you for sharing that. And this question kind of goes for both of you as well. We'll start with Kristen. What improvements would you like to see in federal accountability systems to ensure timely, actionable data for educators?
So we've seen federal proposals um, impact data and funding in a negative way in a couple of ways. So, number one, the president's budget dramatically underfunded research and accountability at the federal government. So, there's a nonpartisan institute, the Institute for Education Sciences at the Department of Education, that does a lot of this work. They fund the research, they oversee some of the data collection, and the president's budget underfunded that institute by 67%, cut it by 67%. So that was incredibly alarming. And administrative actions that have been taken to end contracts that were doing research have been very disruptive in looking towards establishing that roadmap. Sarah talked about this. I talked about this. We need that continued investment in those key challenges. We need it to be really honed. We need it to be really aligned with what we are facing at the federal level. So we might have been able to see a little improvement there in making sure that there was a connection. But to just stop it in its tracks is something that will impact the future. So that's something that we are really advocating for, is stable and consistent funding. We're going back to that same platform we had at the beginning, that stable and consistent funding for that educational research at the federal level. And then to talk a little bit about the data, something else that has also been at issue with both funding and administrative actions at the federal level is assessment data. So both the president's budget and the House bill for education funding for FY 2026 eliminated the funding for state assessment grants. And what that would mean is that there's an actual provision that says if there's no funding for this, states can pause their assessments. So to not fund that, in addition to cutting that funding that is needed, it also would allow states to take actions which deprive school board members of the data that they need to do this work. So that's something that we are really concerned about. They have to have that data. They can't have any gaps in that data. Like even to stop that for 1 year would be incredibly disruptive towards the work that school board members are doing to use that data to hold themselves and their districts accountable. So that's another thing that we're really concerned about. In addition to these funding proposals or lack of funding proposals, the administration has also sought waivers of any aspect of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And so while sometimes waivers can be good, and we support waivers to increase flexibility with, for example, paperwork, those kinds of things, if we were to allow states to waive, for example, the requirement that they hold school districts towards disaggregating the data that they provide. So, for example, the federal government requires that not just school districts and schools provide data on average, but that they provide individual data for student groups that have traditionally really needed improvement. So we disaggregate data for students with economic disabilities, with economic needs, with disabilities, with those who have had achievement gaps in the past, like Black students or Hispanic students or English language learner students. All of those students need a focus from school boards because they do exhibit achievement gaps. And we do need to look at that data and say, how is this group faring under this proposal? How is this group faring under this program? How is this group faring under what we are doing? And do we need to take additional actions to accelerate growth? And the only way towards those decisions is if we have the data. So I was a school board member for 12 years. And one of the most critical things that helped our school district move the needle for students was understanding that school by school data that was provided by that federal legislation that required that data. So we had that school level data for each student group at each individual school. And that's how we were able to tell that what we were doing wasn't enough.
Yeah.
And that's what drove additional additional investments. And the thing is, without opening that dialogue, without being honest about that data, those actions wouldn't have happened. And it takes intentional acts for students to continue to improve, especially when they're exhibiting long-standing, persistent achievement gaps. And that's the situation we're at for the United States right now. The data that came out through the NAEP, the data that we're talking about supporting, showed that we're dramatically in need of assistance, particularly at the high school level. The data for 12th grade students was the lowest data ever recorded.
Wow.
And Illinois data confirms that. This national data, our state level data, is showing declines in achievement that we've got to address. And the only way that we can address it is by having that consistent disaggregated data, both the state level and then that national level data, so that school boards can hold themselves and their districts accountable. So that's a real, we're couching it in the need of improvement. It's not necessarily improvement, it's just maintenance.
Mhm.
We're hoping that we maintain these structures that are so critical. And so that's something that our position statement with CASBA supports, is the maintenance of those key things. And then that maintenance of that key funding for evidence-based research that will shine the light on the practices that are showing promise and how to implement them at the district level. And so that's the kind of things that we want to see through our position statement and through our priority for IASB at the federal level this year.
Yeah, that's great. And data-informed decision-making is one of the safest and easiest ways to see at a bird's eye view, I guess, of what the needs are of really like at the most micro level down to the individual student. And so I agree those improvements really would make a drastic improvement to the accountability systems. So Kristen, looking ahead, what role should federal funding play in supporting innovation and equity in Illinois schools? You kind of did touch on this in your last answer, but still I think it'd be good to kind of discuss the innovation and equity in Illinois schools.
I did, but I think it's a really critical part of the mission. We're talking right now a lot about the Department of Education, right? And there's lots of different things that are being proposed. At its heart, the Department of Education, its mission is to assist school districts with the students who are most in need of improving. That's what equity is. So really, the heart of the Department of Education is helping to provide additional support, additional research, additional oversight, additional guidance for school districts who are really, and school districts and school boards who are really, really working to change the narrative and to change the future for students. And so I think as we see proposals for the Department of Education, as we see funding proposals, as we see administrative actions, we have to evaluate how we feel about those things when we look at, is it meeting that core mission for the Department of Education at the federal level? Because
Yeah.
we have a very small percentage of federal funding that goes to school districts. If you look at a school district's budget, it's, about 9-10%, depends on the school district, but we're looking at a lot of the funding that supports students is provided by local taxpayers.
Mhm.
And then there's a portion by the state. But that federal portion, its mission is to help school districts with the students who are most in need of improvement, with those with disabilities through IDEA, with those who are economically challenged through federal school lunch, through Title I, through our school-based Medicaid program. All of these programs are geared towards helping school districts have a little bit of a leg up in their work to help all students improve. And so I think that that's a really important part of what the role is for federal funding when we're supporting equity in Illinois schools. And supporting innovation, it is tied to that. So like, again, that federally funded research we've talked about, that is looking at innovative ways that we can do things differently to see better results. And so that's the kinds of things that federal investment is going toward. We want to see that continue because we need it. We really need that funding and that innovation to help us meet the challenge of our students, not just for today, but for tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's our goal. We're really working towards it, preparing them for tomorrow. And if they're coming out of high school, worse off than they were before, if they're coming out of high school with some students having a lot less proficiency than others, then that's something that we need to meet. That's a challenge we need to meet so that the future for all students is the promise that they deserve.
Yeah. Thank you for saying, yeah, this is a really good overview. And especially with the innovation and feeding into equity and kind of vice versa. I mean, innovating in the education space to ensure that the next generation of leaders and students have what they need to succeed in tomorrow's world, and making sure that innovation is equitably applied across the board is tantamount. And so, yeah, I think that's just a really good. Or thank you for explaining how and why that rural federal funding is important in that space. And thank you, Sarah, Kristen, for sharing the federal priorities for the spring session. It's a lot, but it's important work that we're doing there. And so we're gonna
So important.
yes, shifting gears down a little bit more local to the state and local priorities. We're gonna go over to Sarah. And Sarah, if you could just discuss or share with us, how has the evidence-based funding formula changed the landscape for Illinois schools, and what needs to happen to protect its integrity?
Thanks, Isaac. Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important with the evidence-based funding formula to recognize, and it passed, I think, in 2017, so it's been almost a decade that it's been in place. But prior to the evidence-based funding formula, Illinois we had one of the most least equitably funded funding formulas in the entire United States. I think we kind of flipped with Nevada and Illinois every couple years, but it was when we moved to the EBF formula, it was really a shift from the General Assembly saying, well, how much money do we have to give each year, to a formula that really said, this is how much money each district needs to be successful. It was based on the students that were within that district, I believe 27 different factors. And it really shifted from something that just was not working for Illinois to something that I think makes a lot of sense and really does serve school districts and its students. So the really important piece of the funding formula is that any new money, well, actually two things, let me back up. So one important piece of it is that all districts were held harmless. So what that means is that what districts were receiving from the state before was not going to change. They would continue to receive that. But it shifted from any new money that the state put in through the formula would go to the districts most in need, which is tier funding. So we always hear $350 million for EBF, and that's generally true. But I think one of the things that people don't realize is that $300 million is what actually goes into those tiers, which is the districts most in need. And that $50 million was actually reserved for something called property tax relief grant. And I raised that this year or at this podcast because this is the first year that the property tax relief grant was not funded. So we actually saw EBF being funded at $307 million this year. But I do like to remind people that the tier funding, which is a really critical piece of that, not that property tax relief is not important, but that the tier funding has continued. And with the exception of 1 year during the pandemic, the state has been great about continuing to put new money into that funding formula. So that's been huge. That's been almost $2 billion
Wow.
over the past 9 years, I guess, that has gone into EBF. And so that needs to continue until all of our districts are fully funded. So that's a really important component of EBF. And so we do continue to support that continued funding. Just we saw before EBF, there was a lot of inconsistency depending on what the state budget is. And so I think EBF just really created an important framework for the General Assembly to know how they're going to prioritize funding public education.
Yeah, for sure. And that evidence-based funding formula is so critical to make sure that we're getting the dollars to this districts that need it most. So it's really good to see that that's still going. What would you say are the biggest challenges with mandated categorical funding for special education and transportation, and how can the state address them? Especially with federal and these state priorities we're going to be talking about, I'm sensing this trend of funding is the big question here with a lot of this stuff. And it's interesting to see just how many questions we have and how many important areas in the education space this funding from the state and federal platforms feeds into it.
Thanks, Isaac. Yeah, and one of the things that we have really been focused on is mandated categoricals. So I think one of the biggest challenges with mandated categoricals is that most people don't know what mandated categoricals are. So we call them mandated categoricals or MCATs, and it's really important to understand that when they created EBF, they tried to get as much as they possibly could into the funding formula so that it all flowed through EBF. There were certain things that just didn't work in EBF. And three really important pieces of that are special education transportation, regular transportation, and special education facilities. So I mean, if you look at transportation, you have some districts that might all be within a couple miles. They don't provide any transportation. And then you have, possibly rural districts where some kids are on the bus for 45 minutes
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning and end of the day. So they really decided that some of these pieces of school funding just isn't going to fit in the formula and needs to be done individually by districts and so that they can meet their individual mandates and their needs. So one of the things that we've really seen in the past 9 years, we've had a huge transition of new legislators, and there's been a ton of education on the EBF. So why we did it, why we switched, how important it is. And so I've never had a conversation with a legislator that they didn't know what EBF was. On the flip side, we have these separate buckets of school funding, which represent well over $1 billion
Right.
that a lot of legislators aren't as familiar with. Um, and I would point out, I mean, similar to what Kristen was saying with IDEA funding, two of these big buckets really helped our most vulnerable population of students, which is our students with IEPs and special needs. So I think, until about 10 years ago, at least those buckets, the two was for special education students, those were pretty well funded. But over the past 10 years, I think we've seen less and less of a support for that. And I think you're absolutely right, Isaac. I think there's a lot of need for funding. And I was at a meeting with higher ed and with early childhood, and to be totally clear, there's a lot of needs in those areas as well. But one of the things that Kristen and I have really been talking about is what's unique about both MCATs and IDEA funding and possibly some other federal sources is that there was a commitment made at a point that the federal government and the state government was going to fund a certain percentage of these services.
Yeah.
And so that commitment has wavered. And we do completely understand that there's challenges at the state level, there's budget challenges, but we are really looking this as a commitment. And I think for a lot of our districts, when we entered into EBF, there was an expectation that that commitment would continue.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what you see happening, even, with tier 3 and tier 4 districts that really are not getting very much at all new money from EBF, now that these other categoricals are being prorated, they're actually getting less money from the state that they should. And that's
Right.
really falling on their local taxpayers. And even with the tier 2 districts, they're getting some money from EBF, but that's being drawn away to these mandated categoricals that are not being funded. So I think for EBF to really have a commitment to EBF, I think we really need to have a commitment to those mandated categoricals as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, and thank you for explaining what a mandated categorical was, because I didn't really know what that was either. So it's good to get the understanding, especially, and it's kind of comforting knowing that the legislators don't really know what it is either sometimes. So I think it's good that we're informing them what that is and why it's so critical and how it's differentiated from EBF.
Thanks. And the other thing I would point out too, just with the transportation, and again, this is a state mandate, but it is so important. I mean, if we're talking about educating students and focusing on public education, we need to get the kids there.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we've seen since the pandemic is a huge rise in chronic absenteeism. So actually providing that transportation is a huge piece of getting kids to school, to and from school. So I think we need to start looking at those mandated categoricals as just not something extra, but something fundamental to serving all of our kids and making sure they're getting quality public education.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Sarah, I was going to say that one of the biggest challenges with mandated categorical funding is the name.
That you can't
Truly,
say
like,
it. No one can.
well, it's hard to say, and it's not explanatory of of all of these things that we're talking about. You know what I mean? It doesn't have. That's one of the biggest challenges to me is like that encompassing all of that promise and all of what that funding is doing. It's not really present necessarily in that name, and so that's one of the biggest challenges that I think about that is making sure that we express all that as we're talking about it, so that people understand all of that.
And that is a challenge. I was talking to one representative, and she said the name MCAT sounded like a medical term. And I was like,
Yeah.
yes, it does.
Yeah.
It's hard because I think with our school business managers, with the legislators that are, and to be clear, I mean, I will just say Senator Senator Capel has been a huge, huge advocate for this. And we've talked to Senator Billy Vollum about this. He's the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. He really gets it. There's more and more legislators that are really trying to understand this issue and the impact. And I will just say ISB, they said that this is the first year that they've been doing their budget hearings that they've gotten more requests for MCATs than they actually did for EDF. So I think
Wow.
that education is starting to work and people are starting to see it. And the other piece of this too, Isaac, is just those costs are going up a lot. I mean, we have inflation, we have other reasons why those costs are going up, but we're just not keeping up. The state isn't keeping up with their end of the reimbursements to pay for those services. And again, it's just falling on the districts and they're feeling that pressure.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts, it sounds like. So, Sarah, why is curricular mandate reform a top priority this year? And what benefits would a comprehensive review bring to students and districts? We talked a bit earlier about the funding, and you mentioned briefly some mandates, and we can talk about this curricular mandate too.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that we hear a lot from our districts on unfunded mandates, and our legislators hear a lot from us about unfunded mandates. But to be honest, I mean, it's overwhelming. There's over 700 of them. So the question really becomes, if we're going to do something about them, how are we going to do that? And so last year you saw Senate Bill 1740 pass, and that kind of got rid of some. There were two things that bill did. It got rid of some of those duplicative mandates, some things that, we could delete, but it also created a mandates reduction council. And so one of the thoughts behind the mandates reduction council is that, it's a group of people. IASB has representation on it. All of the groups do, unions, there's legislators. But one of the thoughts behind that is that we really need to take a look at different buckets of mandates and see how we can work to reduce them. I will say with curricular mandates, there can be a financial impact. But one of the things that we're really seeing with curricular mandates is, one, the impact on teachers with some of those piecemeal mandates that just come each year, then they have to change curriculums. But we're also seeing the impact on students. And that we're really seeing that particularly with graduation requirements. So we have a set of graduation requirements right now. Last year, with the last 2 years, we've seen changes to the financial literacy requirement. We saw a bill that was introduced that would require 1 year of computer science. We have the foreign language mandate that was passed a couple of years ago. That's going into effect in 27, 28. So I think one of the concerns that we've really seen is the impact on students and the availability of teachers to teach some of these requirements. So one of the things we've done a great job in Illinois recently is just really focusing on college career pathways and really acknowledging that there's definitely students that are going to college. There's other students that may take a different pathway. They may go to community college. They, may not go on to a 4-year college, or they may. And so there's been work done through the direct admission program to kind of highlight, that this is an option. But then for students who want to do something different, there's other pathways for them as well. So we've done that. But I think when they're in high school and they kind of know what their passion is and what they really want to pursue, when we add these new mandates on that they have to take each year, the only option really is that you take away something else. So, I mean, if you're really passionate about engineering, you want to take the higher level engineering courses. If there's other state mandates that fill up your schedule, you have to choose those. And I guess the other point of this too is just, you take out the college and career readiness piece. I mean, I think high school provides a really amazing opportunity for kids to explore different things. Do we like foreign languages? Do we like art? And I have heard anecdotally from many different districts, for some kids, the only reason that they attend school is for that art class
Wow.
because they love that art class. So I think just really taking a holistic view of a student's schedule is really important because, again, we always tell legislators it's not that computer science isn't important, but we have kids for different kids, like different things are going to be important to them. And so I think it's been since 2004 since we've really taken a look at those required graduation requirements. And maybe it is time to shift to something different, but we can't keep piling on more and more mandates without taking other pieces out. So I think it's a really delicate balance if you want everyone to graduate from high school with having done certain things and having certain foundational knowledge, but then just also really being flexible enough to let kids pursue different passions and different careers and have that flexibility.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up mandates and how we can't just keep piling on more mandates, because it leads us into our next question about the Mandate Reduction Council, which is, I think that's pretty clear what that's all about instead of the MCATs. How can the Mandate Reduction Council help relieve pressure on districts while maintaining the high standards for learning?
Well, I think we're going to see how it plays out. I don't, they were supposed to have a meeting. That's right. They were supposed to have a meeting, but December isn't the greatest time. So I think that got pushed to January. But I really hope that this group can get together and kind of look at how we can reduce some of our current mandates, but also in some respects, create a process for when new mandates are introduced. So already this year, we're seeing all kinds of curricular mandates for, changes to the cursive handwriting requirement, some new units of study for history, and all these different things. And I think the challenge for us is we're not saying that they're not important, but I think how they're introduced is really critical. And so I think if we can use this council to really think through some of those curricular mandates that are being introduced. We want to be thoughtful about what constituents bring, what legislators bring, but we want there to be a more thoughtful process before that's just kind of put on school districts, because that's challenging when a single bill is passed, then they have to change their curriculum. So, for example, if we're going to look at what's taught in American history, let's really look at that. And let's make a really thoughtful approach and change that holistically instead of just adding different units of instruction each year, because there's a whole process that districts go through once they get a mandate, from the administration to curriculum to teachers, figuring out how they're going to teach it, when they're going to teach it. And so I really hope that council can be helpful in creating a process for looking at these new mandates. And if it makes sense, then I think there's, definitely a way to introduce them, but we want it to be a thoughtful process.
Absolutely. And I think it would help reduce some of the burden on a lot of these school districts who have all these mandates that they're expected to follow. And it can be overwhelming, daunting, and probably even feels impossible at times. So, yeah, I really hope that I'm sure we'll get some really good feedback and outcomes from this council. How would you say the vision for balancing statewide expectations and local flexibility looks like in practice? Because at IASB, we do emphasize the importance of local control. And then we do have, but on top of that, we have the statewide expectations. So how would you say that that balance works in practice?
That is a great question. And I think a lot of times we've just kind of had these conversations piecemeal as new pieces of legislation are introduced. And so I think our vision really is to have a place where those conversations can happen. And we're really hoping that the Mandate Reduction Council can be that place. I mean, I think when we go back to EBF, one of the things that they did with EBF is when that passed, they said, we really want to make sure that this formula has integrity. And they created the PRP, which is the committee that looks at all new proposals. So if there's ever going to be a proposed change to the formula, the funding formula, it has to go through the PRP first to really see like what's the impact going to be, how is it going to impact different school districts, and how can we maintain the integrity of that formula. So I think, hopefully we will kind of take the Mandate Reduction Council will take a big picture look at all of the mandates. Hopefully they can put those into buckets, figure out what to do with those, but then figure out ways, like I said, the process, so that, we don't want education to look the same 20 years from now that it does today, but we also don't want to, just piecemeal make these changes. We do want it to be holistic. So I think that's kind of the vision. And that was a really important piece of Senate Bill 1740, which passed, is that we hope it creates a process. And I mean, it does create a process. So we hope that it's really meaningful and continues.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. We've talked about federal priorities, the state and local priorities. I think it would be good just to kind of wrap up this episode with kind of a key takeaway from both of you. So, Kristen, we'll start with you. If you could share one message with school board members and education advocates from across Illinois about how they can help advance these priorities we discussed today, whether at the state or federal level, what would it be?
I think I would say be brave. Don't be afraid to talk about the challenges you're facing, the tools you need to see change. I think we sometimes can see evidence of the challenge as a failure, and that's certainly a narrative that opponents of public education will sometimes go to. But I think it increases the confidence of everyone to be honest about what we're facing, about what we need to succeed, whether that's stable funding, whether that's assessment data, whether that's good federally funded research. We sure aren't going to get there if we're not having this honest conversation, because it takes intentional action. And so I would just say our kids' very futures depend on us being brave. So don't be afraid to be brave on their behalf.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Kristen. Sarah, same question for you.
I love Kristen's answer, but the one thing I always tell school board members is that your voice really does matter. Legislators really do care what you have to say. I think, you are your students' voice, your community's voice, and we have big pieces of legislation, we have big issues, we have big policy initiatives, but legislators really want to see what the actual impact will be to their districts and to the students in their districts. And school board members have a really, really unique role in that conversation. And in my experience, legislators want that information. They want to know how a piece of legislation that is being proposed will impact their district, for good or for bad. And they do listen. So I think it can be a little scary at times to make that leap into advocacy and into meeting with legislators. But we do have an advocacy ambassadors program. We have 160 members. We just hired someone to really lead that work, who is amazing. And so that is going to be one of our focuses this year, is really to help our board members get involved in that work. And I think I can say it now because it's official that we are going to be having an advocacy day on March 24th. And that's going to be in Springfield. And Kristen knows we've done a federal advocacy day in DC the past few years. But that's a little bit more of a commitment. It's slightly more expensive, very, very important. And we love that. But we really have had board members reach out to us and say, hey, just, one day event in Springfield would also be great. And so we are going to be doing that this year. And we're excited.
Yeah, that's really exciting and a really good opportunity to network with like-minded peers about how to advocate for your issues at the state and federal levels. I'm really excited that IASB is offering that for everyone to help people take advantage of that opportunity. Well, Kristen and Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast to discuss the priorities for the spring session. It is a lot of ground to cover, but it's important that our members understand where we're going to be coming from, why we're making the decisions that we're making, and how it can affect them at their board level. And of course, boards, please reach out to your local legislatures to discuss these topics with them so they understand how they affect your school district and your community. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your service. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and thank you for your dedicated volunteer service to public education. If you would like to stay up to date with future episodes, please consider following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, or your platform of choice. Have a comment or question? We welcome listener feedback and invite you to send us an email at communications@iasb.com. Thank you.